All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to APCO and the American Chamber of Commerce's second roundtable in our American election series. I want to thank the American Chamber of Commerce for their support for this election series. Today's discussion is going to be focused on the communication trends that are really at play at the heart of this campaign and how we might see some of those trends and lessons learned play out in the business world and also here in France as we ourselves begin to think about an important election year next year with the regional elections and the upcoming presidential election in 2022. So my name is Cody LeBlanc. I am the co-director of our digital strategy team here in Europe. I'm going to be moderating a hopefully really interesting discussion on the American election with four really interesting panelists this evening. So I just want to emphasize the fact that all of our panelists are here tonight as individual analysts, and their views are not representative of any organizations to which they might belong. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. To begin with, we have Margot Haddad. She's hosted the morning TV show Smart World on Be Smart with CNBC. I actually just started watching last week, and I really like the bilingual format.
Thank you.
We also have Spencer Boyer, who is a member of APCO's International Advisory Council. He's a former National Intelligence Officer for Europe at the US National Intelligence Council, and he served in senior roles in both Obama administrations. We then have, well, I should also mention that Spencer is not only a Francophile, but a Francophone and has both lived and worked in Paris. So last week we were exchanging neighborhood tips. Next up, we've got Dan Scanling. Dan is the Senior Director in our APCO Worldwide Washington office and our public affairs practice there. He was Chief of Staff and Director of Communications for a combined 25 years in Congress. And he's here to bring us an insider perspective on the election in the United States. Finally, we've got my colleague Dan Smith, also from our Washington office. Dan sits right at the intersection of digital strategy, communications, and public affairs. So really excited to talk to him about some of the interesting digital trends that we've seen during this election. So thank you guys for joining. Appreciate you all taking the time. We're going to dive right in. And I think, this campaign has been marked, of course, by COVID-19 and by a slew of other controversies, which at times I think have probably masked some of the key issues at the heart of the campaign, which is bigger than just a battle for the White House. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Scanling, who's going to walk us through a little bit what's at stake, what scenarios we can potentially expect, and what he thinks has been really at the heart of this campaign season.
Hey, everybody. We wanted to level set before we got too deep into the issues. So we are 8 days away from Election Day. It'll be next Tuesday here in the States. And there's four scenarios of how this could play out. There's what I call the status quo, which would be President Trump is reelected, the Democrats hold on to the House, and the Republicans hold on to the Senate. And that's the way it is in Washington right now. It's a Republican White House, Republican Senate, and a Democratic House. The next scenario would be a split decision. That would be that Joe Biden is elected president, the Democrats retain control of the House, and the Senate stays in Republican hands. If that were to happen, you'd probably see unmitigated gridlock in Washington because the Republicans would become total obstructionists that anything that the Democrats would want to try to do or a Biden administration would want to do. I think the most likely scenario, what you're going to see, is a blue wave, which is Joe Biden wins the presidency, the Democrats hold the House, and the Democrats take a narrow majority in the Senate. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more on what the difference between that and a blue tsunami is. And a blue tsunami would be, again, a Democratic sweep, but with a much larger margin in the Senate. And what for anybody that's watching politics in Washington, the key here is going to be that margin in the Senate, because if it's larger, it's going to mean the left progressives in Washington are going to have more control of the agenda and where things go. If it's just a simple 51-49 majority in the Senate, the moderates will control Washington, and it will be more about deal making and having to work with Republicans. But as you get a bigger majority in the Senate, watch the pendulum in Washington to swing much farther to the left, because it'll be a much more aggressive agenda going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cody to jump right into it as we've level set of what to kind of expect next week.
Sure, thanks. So I guess I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that everyone can see all of our speakers. And I'm gonna direct questions, but if you have a point of view, please feel free to jump in. And Margot, maybe we can get your perspective as a journalist. Your take on the relationship between communicators and the press and trying to obtain media coverage. When you're looking at coverage of the election campaign, what has characterized it? I mean, what have been the communication practice, the most surprising, the most interesting, the most unique, maybe the most successful? What has the press really been talking about when covering this election?
I think what America is showing us in France is that you can, as a president, attack the media directly. Before I joined the show and I became an anchor for a Smart World with CNBC, I used to work at CNN. And I remember Donald Trump calling directly the newsroom to get on air. That's something that you would never see in France, or having the direct number of the newsroom directly to get on air. And I think the mainstream media kind of played with it, wanted to get a huge audience and let some of the politicians who wanted to get on air to be on air. And actually, as a producer, that's your role to say yes or no. And I think for the 2016 elections, they played with the wave of Donald Trump getting on air, getting on Twitter. I think it made a lot of journalists laugh, not knowing that it could be a possible scenario. Now they kind of backed up a little bit, not giving that much room to a politician that we used to have during the 2016 elections. That would never happen in France. You would never have a politician calling directly the newsroom and getting their message on air. So I think that's what we've seen by having Donald Trump using Twitter more and more and having some policies to block that. But it's a complete different scenario from our perspective here.
Right, it's much less scripted as well, and there are much fewer regulations about how the press can cover the different elections. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, the sound is breaking a little bit.
Okay.
Couldn't hear.
All right. Spencer, I wanted to turn to you and ask you a question as well, because the campaign has often been described as a battle for the soul of the nation. But we've seen in this campaign period a little less focus, I think, on policy and on actual platforms, and more on the differences, the fundamental character differences between these two candidates. And I'm wondering, what have been the key moments in the campaign for you? What were the most important when we think about this battle for the soul of a nation? And how did the candidates really differ in their constructing of this idea of a national narrative?
Well, thanks so much. It's a great question. And I thought I would just talk just a little bit about what I think this election is about, kind of getting at your question of the different themes of the campaigns. So to level set, as was done a little bit earlier, historically elections in the United States have really been a referendum on the incumbent. And that's certainly turning out to be the case this year. The fact that the Democratic candidate consistently deemed most electable, Joe Biden, made it through a gauntlet of more than 20 candidates tells you a lot about the mood of the electorate. I think there was a belief early on that this might be the year for a left wing candidate, a far left candidate to break through, given the anger that many voters had at Donald Trump for what they would characterize as more of a right-wing populist agenda. But voters, particularly Black voters who saved Joe Biden's candidacy in South Carolina before that primary earlier this year, as well as moderate suburban voters, really got behind Joe Biden in a very crowded field, which allowed him to come out on top. It was also an increasingly difficult and incredibly challenging year for primary voting, given the massive disruption of COVID-19, which caused our primaries and caucuses to be postponed. It was a great help, I think, for the Democrats that several leading candidates dropped out right before Super Tuesday in the spring, when so many states vote in the United States for a primary, which allowed Joe Biden to stave off a strong challenge from Senator Bernie Sanders in particular. So, there are certainly traditional Democratic, Republican, progressive, conservative splits right now as we're heading into the general election next week on issues like science and the environment, racial justice, immigration, taxes, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's known. But what I think is most surprising to me when looking at this election versus others is the number of traditional Republicans and conservatives that have come out against President Trump. You have former high-level Republican administration officials, former military leaders, groups like the Lincoln Project, which are staffed by high-level Republicans who are doing hard-hitting ads against the president. It's really kind of an unusual dynamic. I think these groups, as well as many on the left and in the center, are focused on what they would characterize as an assault on democratic institutions, media, law enforcement, the intelligence community, courts, Congress, and as you were mentioning, the identity and reputation of America more than any specific issue. And as you alluded to, Biden's theme of restoring the soul of America really gets at that. On the other side, I think Republicans who didn't put out a platform, it makes it hard to say that this is really mostly about the issues. For some supporters, it's about President Trump's America First vision, which they like, where the top priority is preserving an America that the president and his base see as disappearing. His law and order response to the protests over racial injustice this year have resonated with some, although not to the extent that the president hoped. 2020 is turning out not to be 1968 in that sense. And some support for the president is certainly grounded in support for the Republican Party above all else, or political tribalism, where folks might not like the president or even really dislike him, but they fear the other side more. And then finally, I think some support is of course based on specific issues: courts, abortion, taxes, gun rights, among many who are single issue voters. I think we're seeing Vice President Biden's support being more diverse. He's getting a large slice of minorities, suburban women, young voters, older voters worried about COVID, educated voters, and a much larger share of the white vote than Hillary Clinton got, especially those with high incomes. And President Trump, on the other hand, is doing very well with rural, non-college educated white voters, including a majority of men, and continues to do very well with evangelicals. I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to talk about congressional dynamics later.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very succinct analysis of this entire campaign so far. I'm wondering, does anyone want to highlight any specific events in the campaign so far? Anything that stood out from a communications perspective? If not, we can move on to looking at the digital perspective of the campaign. But I want to keep this idea of key events in mind, just because we recently had the debates, and I think both candidates were, like every year, putting a lot of stock into these debates, which turned out to be less important than I think many foresaw. So it's been a unique election campaign in the sense that there haven't been a lot of marking events like there were in 2016, where you really had punctual scandals that defined the campaign.
Well, Cody, I would just jump back before we jump on it. The conventions, that was a brand new thing. The way that normally our nominating conventions, thousands and thousands and thousands of people go to cities for these nominating conventions, and they're held in person, and it's a week-long party that has formal parts that are televised and has very informal parts that aren't. This time it was all virtual, and I think that's probably going to be the way it's going to be in the future, just because I think that they controlled the message that much more going forward. So I think anybody that wants to go back and look at the communications aspect of this, I would highly recommend to go back and look what was done at the conventions and how quickly both campaigns pivoted and produced essentially 5 nights of television programming, all virtual, all on, all pre-recorded or recorded at different locations. So from a communication standpoint, I would definitely look at the conventions as something that all of us as communicators should look at going forward.
I would just jump in saying I think that the COVID-19 narrative is probably the thing that really has struck me in terms of different approaches of the campaigns. Obviously, President Trump has been focused on telling Americans that this is under control, we've turned the corner, a vaccine is coming, and Vice President Biden having a much different narrative in terms of what's happening in the country, the danger to America, and what he would do differently than the president has done. President defending his actions, Vice President and others talking about failures with regards to dealing with it. And that narrative is run throughout this campaign, and the president trying to shift and change, to pivot to other issues that he feels are maybe more favorable grounds. That has been more challenging, I think, than he thought. And we'll see in the end how much that impacts his ability to be elected.
Also, I wanted to jump in saying that it's been easier to collect data these days. That's the thing that we, knew we had in 2016, but in 2020, that became bigger and bigger to target your audience and who you want to send your message with. So that these are tools that actually candidates know how to use these days, which in 2016, the big tech companies actually suggested to some campaigns to get some sort of advisor to know how to use these tools during the campaigns. That was not the case in 2020, but the Trump campaign agreed to having an advisor on their board to suggest how they could use these tools on Twitter, on Facebook. And the Hillary Clinton campaign declined and didn't want that. And I think they lost something very big there by not knowing how to use these data at this time.
Yeah. I'm glad you raised that, Margot, because I was just doing some research before we jumped on the phone here. And in March, before really COVID started to the extent that we've seen it today, the Biden campaign only had 19 digital staffers. And at this point, they now have 200 folks on staff. And they've invested millions, and they've really built an apparatus that can be on par with, or at least compete with, the Trump administration. I think to your point, the Clinton campaign was woefully underprepared for the digital machine that Trump built in 2016. And we'll get into this in a little bit with Cody, but I think that the ways in which the Biden campaign has adapted and sort of come into the 21st century and really leaned into digital campaigning, especially as we all move forward in this virtual mode, has been crucial for them and an important step forward in kind of evening the balance there in terms of their campaign approach.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first campaign really that's been 100% digital, as opposed to previous ones. And really, I think it's because of all of these issues that you just raised, but primarily it's because of COVID-19, of course. It has to be online by necessity. Although that's a communication choice in and of itself, for one candidate to insist on in-person events and another to largely stick to the virtual. I think also because of Cambridge Analytica and the 2016 scandal, there's now an increased scrutiny on these data-driven practices. And so there's more regulation in place as well, both from the platforms and from different legal bodies that are preventing some of the same things that happened last time. And then finally, there's the question around misinformation, where this time, it's not necessarily from foreign state actors, but from the White House itself. And so how do platforms deal with misinformation? How do journalists deal with misinformation? These are the three big things I think that are driving the digital context. And I'm curious to ask you, Dan, about the digital strategies of each of the candidates in this context. What do you think is really at the core of each side, and what has differentiated their digital communication strategies?
Sure. And before I get into that, Cody, I do want to touch on something you just said, which is, we're seeing this rise and candidates are being forced to run their campaigns entirely virtually. At the same time, the rise of disinformation is forcing platforms to change their policies in unprecedented ways. So let's talk about a few of those. Facebook, starting tomorrow through November 3rd, and then for the week after the election, potentially longer, has placed a temporary ban on all political advertising. So unprecedented ban on any sort of issue advertising. For a number of the clients that I work with, it means we can't talk about sustainability for a few weeks. This is kind of the breadth of the policy measures that they are taking to avoid what is certain to be, some controversy around the results just based on the ways in which we have had to vote because of COVID-19. By the same token, just did some research before this. Facebook removed 77 million posts, which were spreading misinformation about COVID-19 from Facebook and Instagram between April and June. And have placed 98 million warning labels on content which were misleading about the virus. So that's just about COVID misinformation. If you take it in the context of the election, from March to July, Facebook removed over 102,000 posts that were violating interference with politics standards. So at the same time, we're seeing people being forced to use these platforms to get information or to share information about the elections. We're seeing platforms being forced to crack down on this rampant misinformation. And I think that really has affected and impacted the ways in which the two campaigns are using the platform, in that the Trump campaign in the past has really thrived on sowing disinformation and being sporadic in their communications and doing so under the guise of being authentic and transparent. And in 2016, it worked very well in that those communications were seen as Trump sharing what he thinks and saying what he thinks when he wants to. Platforms have now taken unprecedented steps to censor some of his content on Twitter. You saw this with the Hunter Biden controversy last week. So I think these changes have changed a little bit the ways in which they can use these platforms. In terms of the two candidates' approach, I think that the Biden campaign, as I said earlier, has really recognized that they need to step up what they're doing from a digital perspective. The difference is that there's an integrity to their messaging. And their approach is, rather than to fight fire with fire in terms of Trump's sort of vitriol and shooting from the hip, they're going to do this in an authentic and coordinated way. So a couple of things that they've done, which I found were really interesting, they've tried to inhabit the character of the candidate. So rather than fighting fire with fire, they want to show Joe as being that gratitude, that empathy, that compassion that I think people are really yearning for amid COVID-19. And to do that and be authentic and transparent in that empathetic way. They have an archive of Joe Biden's political emails that you can go visit online. You can see every political donating email or ask for donations that he has sent this year and previously. They've been sharing a survey asking their supporters what they want to hear from the Biden campaign in the weeks and months leading up to the campaign. So you have that direct 360 loop for feedback. And I think that's tapping into this unified collective of people who are part of this broader social consciousness that really want to see that kind of empathy and compassion from candidates. At the same time, I think Trump, interestingly enough, when he has been thwarted by Twitter and Facebook with some of the posts that he's placed, has reverted back to in-person rallies as a way to then seem more, sort of bold to his base. In the ways that he's being restricted by digital platforms, he's now reverting back to that in person to say that, we don't need to be concerned about COVID to an extent. And I think that is reflective of the ways in which platforms have forced him to take a step back from his approach previously. So if I could sum it up, briefly, I would say that the Democrats have caught up in the arms race from a digital perspective, and now are taking a lot of the same approaches that Trump did, just in a slightly different method to the madness, and to do so in an integrated way, and find that authenticity and transparency that voters are really looking for from candidates.
I do think the authenticity point is a good one. It's the fact that these candidates clearly have a deep understanding of who their audience is and what exactly is going to resonate with them. I mean, they're in one way they're speaking to their base, but in another way they've understood exactly how to use online communications. And in a lot of ways, what I see from the Biden camp is a textbook playbook of what ideal corporate communications should be. I've been particularly impressed with Biden's influencer strategy. The fact that he's consistently meeting with different people who are iconic in various communities. He's having informal video chats with them. He's reaching different people without resorting to the micro-targeting that was so characteristic of the 2016 election. There have been some really innovative communication practices as well. And something that I find really fascinating, I think is applicable brands at this time too, is the idea that, you know, actions speak louder than words, right? And it's the fact that transportation means can be used as ways of communicating a point. You know, when you see, you know, Donald Trump making the choice to have an election rally in front of an airplane, symbolizing this whole, you know, dynamic of the power of Air Force One, or the individualization of having whatever transportation means at your disposal. And then on the Biden campaign sign, you know, having live streamed events from trains, speaking again to that authentic, you know, Delaware identity that he has as a commuter to Washington. So those two stood out for me, but I'm curious to hear what everyone else thought from a digital perspective, if there was anything particularly resonating throughout the campaign.
I would just add, I completely agree with everything Dan said, as well as you, Cody. I would just add that the fundraising component is really such an important part of the communication strategy now, in a way that I don't think it was previously. When you have event after event where you are not only highlighting the principles, you know, for Vice President Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, but you have all of these surrogates, you know, dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds of surrogates who also have their own events, and they can reach out to groups and have more of that intimate setting to discuss policy. And almost all of these events where they have primary speakers who are talking about an issue of interest to that particular group that they're targeting, you know, women or some diaspora group, or, you know, some particular sort of region of the country, local folks. And I think they've realized that they can touch so many more people than they could in the past, where you had sort of small fundraisers in somebody's house. You know, you got 100 people. Now you can get, you know, 100,000 people. You can get, or 1,000, or, you know, even, you know, 500, but really multiplying that kind of impact. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons that the vice president's campaign has done such a terrific job on fundraising, is that they have really shattered a lot of previous targets with regards to digital fundraising.
If I can jump in on that, I think what the strategists kind of understood this time is that the Americans are very attached to their identity. I identify as an Afro-American person, I identify as LGBT person, and it was easier as well with you know, the data to collect that and actually target more specifically the audience that you wanted. And I think what Spencer is totally right on that, is that people actually, it was easier for them to create Facebook groups, small Facebook groups, get donations from these groups as well, because you target a community as well. And also because America has never been that divided in the recent years. And we see a clear division of, you know, the voters of Trump and the voters of Biden. They're completely, the middle ground of what we had as the swing states right now is in a different dynamic from the previous election. And I think the strategists really understood that it was a really divided society, and that you put people in boxes, and that has been easier as well for strategists to kind of target these certain groups.
I would agree, and I would just say the influencer thing is important and notable, because gone are the days when we just think of influencers as folks marketing products. We're now having them wade into the political sphere. I saw one of the conversations that Joe Biden had was with Alex Rodriguez and Jennifer Lopez, and they had a 5 or 10 minute conversation on Instagram talking about some of the issues. And so you're seeing not only celebrities, but across issue spaces, as Spencer and Margot pointed out. And in that way, you're reaching people where they are, you're meeting them where they are, not only on the issues, but on the platforms that they're using. And given the fact that all of the platforms, regardless of whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, have seen this significant rise in usership, you know that you're going to get views on this. And I think, to Cody's point, it's almost lessened the impact of the debates in ways that we wouldn't expect from previous years. And it's made these more informal social media communications with credible conversations from influencers that feel authentic and transparent, ultimately could have a bigger impact on changing someone's vote than what was said in the debates these past couple weeks.
Yeah, that's true. Those are all really good points. I want to invite people now to, I know we're about halfway through. I just want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A functionality here in the webinar. So if you do have questions, please leave them there and we will get to them at the end of the session. But I want to shift gears slightly, and we've touched upon this a little bit, but I want to focus more about the corporate element of the campaign lessons and communication and what we can take away for businesses. And so far we've seen multiple examples during the campaign of companies, either voluntarily or involuntarily, getting caught up into the bait and then struggling to communicate. And I'm wondering, what kind of lessons can we learn from those incidences? Spencer, I think we spoke about this a bit earlier. What is your point of view on some of these incidences and what these companies have done right or what they could potentially do better?
Well, my thoughts are really just the flip side of what Dan was saying in terms of what campaigns are learning and figuring out, what they can and can't do on social media and what some of the risks are. For me, I think the main takeaway is that companies are having to make tougher calls on what they'll allow on their sites, what security measures they're prepared to take, given the broader democracy, national security, and reputation risk challenges at play because of both foreign and domestic interference and disinformation. As has been mentioned, the global pandemic has certainly created a very inviting environment for the spread of both misinformation and disinformation, including material that is deliberately false and intended to disrupt and suppress the vote. And this all feeds into the existing threat to Western democracies from foreign actors, notably Russia. And the private sector is really in the middle of this, whether they want to be or not. I think Dan covered a lot of the basics in terms of what some of the risks are and how social media companies have been responding. But, just as a reminder, so much of the activity in terms of interfering in democratic elections certainly is not just the US, it's around the world with techniques that go beyond just disinformation, but hacking political targets to steal sensitive information, selectively releasing that information to the public, supporting preferred candidates, propping up destabilizing or extremist political movements, and they're trying to involve private sector in their efforts. Kremlin efforts have included, not just hacking targets related to Joe Biden, but advancing conspiracy theories to counter established facts regarding Russian meddling in the 2016 election, and even providing support for far-right organizations in an attempt to incite white nationalist violence in the U.S. We've had our major security organizations and law enforcement organizations in the U.S. discussing recently China being really involved in the disinformation game. Our Office of Director of National Intelligence recently announced that Iran has attempted to spoof the extremist group, the Proud Boys, and to send threatening messages to Democratic voters through social media and other networks. And I think even though obviously people are feeling that social media companies could do more, I do applaud them for stepping up and trying at least to tackle some of this in terms of their takedowns and labeling and so forth. And we're seeing that even Exxon recently felt compelled to tweet that a conversation the president insinuated he might have had with executives from the company regarding fundraising never happened. So, my main point is that I think that gone are the days when private companies and corporations can pretend that they have nothing to do with misinformation and disinformation, no matter who it comes from.
Yeah, those are all fair points. And right, companies I think are going to have to think a lot more about various scenario planning, a lot of different risk-based scenarios that potentially were never on the radar before, and now are much more part of reality. I'm wondering too if there's something that could be said about economic nationalism and its importance in this debate and that impact on corporations. We have a lot of clients here in France who are part of a larger global or American corporate structure. And so, and you find the same thing on the other side of the Atlantic as well. So how do you deal with economic nationalism if you're a company and you kind of have a double identity of either a very French or European corporation trying to expand your market in the United States, or you're part of a larger global or American brand implanted here in France?
I'll take a stab at that. And I think one thing that's missing here too, particularly in the United States, it was almost the perfect storm. Not only do we have this election swirl, but the social unrest that occurred in the United States and then and COVID, and all that is kind of raised a heightened awareness of everything and put a lot more pressure on companies to speak out and to be leaders in how that goes. I think as far as economic nationals, it'll depend on what happens next Tuesday. If President Trump is reelected and the Senate stays Republican, expect the United States to continue to close in and be much more nationalistic and be much more America first, buy America first. If Joe Biden prevails and the Senate and the House go Democratic, I think you'll see the United States slowly return to a little bit more openness and try and repair some relationships, but it will not happen overnight. Just some things, it's going to take a little while for that to happen. But I think the bottom line is corporations, particularly here in the United States, are being asked to do a lot more than they've ever been asked to do. And it's hard to navigate too, because you're walking a fine line where you might think you're doing the right thing to appease a group on this side, and you're going to alienate somebody on this side. So it is a very, very fine line that these companies are going to have to navigate going forward. And what throws the gas on the fire is what can happen on social media. And just again, this summer there were a number of companies, large brands that boycotted advertising on Facebook in the month of July. And I can remember some initial conversations. This will be nothing. It won't be any big boys. The big boys did come in and play, and it did get Facebook's attention. So there's a lot of a swirl, particularly here in the United States, but a lot is going to depend on what happens next week here in the elections.
Well, I would just add to that, Dan, to say that I agree completely that the bar has been raised for companies, and at the same time, it has been raised in a way where they need to be authentic to their mission and to make sure to stay in their swim lane, and that they're credibly going to take action around a given issue. You know, the days of providing lip service and the typical company statement are gone. People are looking for companies to authentically wade into these issues, and there's definitely an expectation that corporate social responsibility moves beyond lofty goals into concrete action. We actually did a survey at APCO Insight a few weeks ago, just a few findings to reaffirm this. 90% of respondents believe that companies should be very or somewhat involved in key issues from a policy perspective. 93% agree that companies do good for their shareholders when they do good for society. And 88% of folks believe companies should sacrifice short-term financial gains for the long-term benefit of society. These are all just kind of statistics to show that we are at this place where, because of all the events Dan talked about, not just COVID-19, the shift to virtual communications, not just this pivotal election and the ways in which it's a referendum on our character as a nation, but also the social and the civil unrest that has brought about, much needed conversations around social justice. You're seeing this unified collective of people who believe in the need for more of a rising social consciousness come together and ask for companies to do more. So I do think that the waters are somewhat uncharted, and they are certainly difficult to navigate for companies moving forward.
I know we're wrapping up into the final portion of our discussion tonight, so I want to turn our final topic of conversation to France and the potential impacts that this election could have on France, and particularly the lessons that we can draw from a communications point of view, from what we've seen in this presidential campaign in the United States and what we're already seeing or might continue to see in the French political sphere. So Margot, I'm wondering, what lessons can we draw for the upcoming French elections? Are people going to be inspired by some of these, more virtualized campaign events that have been happening on the trail, or innovative communication technologies? What do you think?
So first of all, we have a very different system in terms of campaign. In America, cash and influence are king. That's not the case in France. So we're limited in the amount that we can spend, right? And even in a virtual campaign. So we would not be able to do as much as what American campaigns have done. However, I do think the way politicians use Twitter is going to change very much in France. We started seeing that. We started seeing some tweets about speeches from the president, politicians answering each other on Twitter. That's a new style that we haven't seen in the last elections in France, and that is becoming the new normal here. And on that as well, targeting the media is starting to be something that we see here in France that we haven't seen before, that is starting to change rapidly, in the sense that BFM TV is becoming the new evil. BFM TV, for those who don't know, is the CNN of France, running 24 hours. And obviously you have a lot of guests coming on air commenting whatever the president has said, whatever politicians have said. And in that sense, Twitter is becoming the wide platform to target, specific medias and specific journalists. That's something new that we have seen. And also from the populist side, from Marine Le Pen party, for example, denying is the new normal. And that's a style that we have seen with Donald Trump, is that whatever they say against you, just deny. And that's a new strategy that Marine Le Pen, I think, has learned a lot from Donald Trump in these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think for me, there have been a couple of different practices that definitely were started in the United States that I'm now starting to see in France. This idea of having a direct link with the populace, with the public, and communicating on social media, whether it's Gabriel Attal and his direct, like, Instagram stories, like, let me respond to your questions on the train, or thinking about this year, we've seen in the past few months, President Macron and Mélenchon starting to have a presence on TikTok. Although the ways in which they're using TikTok are perhaps, not exactly accustomed to the way in which most users are using the platform right now.
So they don't have the strategies that you have in America that are very well trained. I follow campaign in the US and I follow campaign in America, in France, and it's two different styles. But I think it speaks to an audience as well. I think, when you target a specific audience, you need to adapt yourself to the country as well. As well as TikTok, that's a different story for us in France. It's running really well here. But at the same time, I think we spoke about transparency before with Danielle. And I think we need to be careful with the word transparency and authenticity, in the sense that for Trump voters, Trump is authentic. He's not lying to his audience. So authenticity has a different meaning for whoever you're speaking to. The way that Donald Trump speaks to his audience is a lot about accusing other people, saying the truth as it is, very raw speech that you don't see in other candidates. And I think for a certain audience, that is actually being transparent and being true to yourself. So I think the way you communicate with your audience, that's why it's so important to know who you're targeting and why data collecting is changing the election so much.
Right, understanding your audience profoundly. The other example that comes to mind is the Minister of Justice here in France, who started some really informal Facebook live streams directly with people to kind of show the behind the scenes, what he's thinking, what his points of view are, and it plays to that point of authenticity.
The only thing I would add, I completely agree with all that Margot just said. The only thing I would add is that for some, whether or not the president is or isn't telling the truth isn't relevant. It's about what they believe to be, his true cause and who he's protecting and so forth. And there are a lot of folks who it will even, in polls and so forth, will say, yeah, he's exaggerating on this or he's not telling the truth on that, but he has our back. He is one, he's pushing for us and our vision and making sure that, within America, that we as a group are looked at in a certain way, are protected in a certain way from changes that folks feel are not advantageous to them. And so I think that what we're seeing in the Trump campaign is that, for some people, as long as they believe that you are on their side, that the ends can justify the means. So that if in the end it's leading to a certain Supreme Court balance, if it's leading to the end of Roe v. Wade, if it's leading to stopping so much immigration into the country, if it's leading to more protectionist policies, whatever it might be, then all the stuff that happens to lead up to that doesn't really matter. So, but I do think that there are some who actually believe a lot of what the president's saying, that most objective analysts would say is not true, based on where they're getting the information.
And actually, that is the illness of our society. We cannot agree on what is the truth these days. So if we cannot agree on what is true, what is the actual true scientific truth, it's all about people's opinion. It's not about what is true and what is going to help us move forward. It's about what I think is true, and that sorry, that will help the voter to choose which candidate they will vote for.
So this idea of truth and accepting reality, we started to get some questions come in on Q&A. So this first one is directly related to that. Curious to hear from probably Dan Scanlon. The question is, what are the risks if the current occupant of the White House refuses to accept the reality of the election and denies the results? What does that look like from a process standpoint? America hasn't really seen anything like that.
That's not going to happen. I know a lot of people think it is. If Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, will go to the White House and tell Mr. Trump, you have lost. It is time to leave. I know there's a lot of spin. America is not going to get into some huge constitutional crisis where Donald Trump sits in the White House after Inauguration Day. That is just not going to happen. There's some people on Trump's side that think that is, but that's not going to happen.
To me, the greater danger might be not that there's a clear winner and all the electors have been certified and he doesn't leave based on that. It's more about the potential legal challenges that are coming if it's close. And we're seeing both sides very mobilized. And if it comes down to a state or two, there are strategies already in place on both sides for dealing with that. But I think folks are concerned that even if it's a fairly large margin or a decent margin that Biden has won, given that the president has already telegraphed and articulated that he believes that this is a fraudulent election because of the number of mail-in votes and so forth, and has told his supporters that. I think that there is some concern that his voters, if he does lose, will not accept it as being legitimate. And if there is a sort of litigation strategy, and the president said himself, I want to get a new Supreme Court justice in before the election in case this comes before them. And so you can imagine a case that goes through the lower courts and gets up to the Supreme Court and the potential chaos that would cause. So while I agree with Dan, and I wish I was, we're as optimistic as Dan Scanlon in terms of saying we have nothing to worry about and our system will work. I certainly know, given my colleagues who work on this every day in terms of voter protection, voter suppression problems, litigation that they're a part of around the country, that there are some legitimate concerns about whether or not the whole transfer will be without any kind of violence, without any kind of constitutional problems going down the pipe. I hope that's the case. There are no problems.
Well, and I think it's notable on that every platform, Facebook, Twitter, even YouTube and TikTok, have already set up policies that if there are any posts which would incite violence based on the sort of controversial outcome of an election or the lack of an outcome, they're immediately going to take those down. And the fact that they have had to set up these policies ahead of time shows that I think there is a concern around, even if Trump isn't holed up in the White House, if there are states that are up in the air, if there's a legal battle that's going to come from that, is the social media battle going to be more so harmful to kind of the general understanding and knowledge of the outcome of the election? I think platforms are doing everything they can, but there's only so much you can do to keep up with disinformation.
Well, that's when you will know whether or not the big techs have really become responsible in that sense. It's following the election, knowing if they will block some pictures of unrest, for example. If we do have some unrest, I mean, I'm not that optimistic about the outcome of the election. I do think we will see some unrest and actually voters not accepting the results, more than actually having one of the candidate not, accepting the results. But I started to worry when Joe Biden actually said, if someone doesn't want to get out of the White House, we will have people to escort him, not naming Donald Trump, obviously, but when you have one of the candidate actually saying that, you can actually question whatever the outcome will be.
Right. I think it's definitely going to be an interim period between the election and inauguration that's, contentious, controversial, litigious, but hopefully not apocalyptic. Let's see, we have got another question. Dan Smith, I'm wondering, let's see, someone is asking about social media platforms and which are the most efficient, which are the most effective for political communications, especially in the context of a presidential election. Can you nail it down to just one or a few?
I can't nail it down to one, but I can nail it down to a few, because I think as Margot and Spencer have touched on, it's about audience-centric communication. So Facebook, despite all of the changes in political advertising regulations, is still the grassroots hub of communications from a social media perspective. And if you're trying to broadly raise awareness and advocate for a given issue, Facebook is the place to do it. So I think that's why you're seeing, candidates continue to pour significant advertising dollars into Facebook, and communicating in a way that they can reach as many people as possible, and find those strands and issues that matter most to them. Twitter is where you would go more so to work with influencers, to have reporters sharing your message. It is very much a more educated usership, and I think reserved for some more news and fact-based issue advocacy, whereas Facebook is a little bit more personal and emotional. I saw a statistic recently that somewhere over 70% of folks would go to Facebook to share political views. So you see people at kind of the one-to-one individual level communicating about issues on Facebook. If you want to get to the point where you're disseminating information from credible sources, you're probably going to go to Twitter. I do think that YouTube is probably lost in the shuffle sometimes, and that it has, aside from Facebook, the largest usership in the world. And when people go to YouTube, they do it to watch videos for a significant amount of time. So you're seeing folks be inundated with political advertisements from both candidates, and are consistently kind of seeing that, and the familiarity and the brand recognition that you get from pre-roll advertisements on YouTube, and the opportunity to do a little storytelling in a 15-second ad could be the difference in shifting someone's opinion. So I think it's a mix of all the above. And then, as we've talked about, even Instagram to an extent has become a place that is sort of waded into political conversations, and that you have influencers having these conversations with candidates and sharing their views on the platform. So as we've seen it, information disseminated from all of these platforms, it's a multifaceted strategy that is first and foremost audience centric, and recognizes the comparative strengths of each one.
Thank you. That's all completely true. And yeah, I'm thinking about TikTok and some of these larger trends and some of these first steps we've seen of French politicians getting into this sort of short video clip game. And really, for me, the first time I became aware of TikTok was with the Washington Post TikTok guy, and during the primary season, and some of his videos. So I think the potential, the political potential of social media platforms is there. And luckily, I think they lend themselves to some really creative formats. And I'm curious to see how different politicians are going to be using them during the campaigns over here.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm glad you raised TikTok. Just to put that in perspective, there was back in June, I believe, a group of folks got together and basically tried to inflate the registration numbers for a Trump rally. and they had 1 million registrants, all from promotion on TikTok for a 19,000 person arena, and ended up not filling the arena. And the whole concept was to basically, sort of grease the wheels and make the Trump campaign feel like they had this massive base of support. And TikTok was unable to recognize that it was a fraudulent effort until the damage had already been done. Just pointing out that I think you're seeing TikTok even wade into politics, which is hard to believe when you go as someone who's rarely spent much time on TikTok. It's hard to believe that that's now a locus for politics as well, but I would agree it's definitely becoming a part of the equation too.
I would say it's becoming a part of the equation for the next election. I think it's how you manage the tool that is important. As we said, for example, Facebook, we're more familiar with Facebook now because it's been created years and years ago, when actually TikTok is quite new for politicians. So, the way they use it in some sort of innovative videos, that is quite complicated when you're not, 12 or 15 years old. They will need to be surrounded by people who actually understand TikTok. But, we'll talk about that next year if TikTok is still in the US. That's a different question.
All right, we're almost at time here. I guess I will just invite any of you guys on the panel to share any final thoughts, any last takeaways. But otherwise, I think we've covered a pretty diverse range of topics in this hour. Anything from anyone? Okay. All right, I want to thank you, all four of you. What's that?
Let's speak in 8 days.
Exactly.
Right, yes.
We'll reconvene in 8 days and have a debrief. Thank you all four of you so much for joining us during this discussion. Thank you again to the American Chamber of Commerce, and thank you everyone who dialed in to listen to us talk about this election and answer your questions. And we'll see what happens. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon or a good night.